"The inventory," said the solicitor, setting down a folder thin enough to be an insult, "is considered largely complete." The folder landed on the edge of the mahogany table the way an afterthought lands, without ceremony, without weight, and Eleanor Voss looked at it the way she looked at most things that claimed to be what they were not, steadily and without comment. The room was cold in the particular way of rooms whose fires have been lit only for occasions rather than for comfort, the kind of cold that lives in the walls regardless of the season. And outside the tall windows the October sky pressed down like pewter against glass. 3 men occupied chairs. Eleanor stood. No one had suggested she sit, and she had not asked. The solicitor's name was Holt, Mr. Reginald Holt, of Holt and Bray, solicitors, a man who smiled when he delivered instructions that might reasonably be taken as an affront. The second man was the land steward for the Ashvale estate, a person named Crane whose dominant habit was the adjusting of his cuffs, which he did now, first the left, then the right, as though the gesture conferred precision on whatever words would follow. The third man was Marcus Ashvale, the 8th Duke of Ashvale, and he had not spoken since Eleanor entered. He sat at the far end of the table with his long hands resting flat on its surface, and regarded her with the particular quality of attention that men with great power reserve for minor things they expect to require no attention at all. He was perhaps 38, lean in the manner of a person who has never thought about it, and his face held an expression Eleanor had catalogued before, the expression of someone who has already reached a conclusion and considers the present conversation a formality to be disposed of before something more important begins. "Miss Voss," said Holt with the tone of a man granting a favor, "comes highly recommended by the Grayfield firm. She has been engaged to complete the inventory of Harwick Mill and the associated outbuildings in preparation for the sale." He paused. "The previous appraiser, Mr. Denny, has taken ill and is unable to continue." "Unable," said Marcus Ashvale. It was not a question. It was the word itself being weighed. "Regrettably so, Your Grace." Ashvale's gaze shifted to Eleanor for the first time, with genuine attention, rather than the assumption of attention, and she met it. She had a habit, not performed, simply present, of becoming very still when observed, a stillness that had nothing of nervousness in it, the way a measuring instrument becomes still when it has found the true level. Holt appeared to interpret this as deference. Ashvale appeared to find it less easily named, and this would be the first thing about Eleanor Voss that he would fail to correctly identify, though it would not be the last. "The sale is scheduled for the 2nd of December, Holt continued, sliding the folder an inch closer to Eleanor as though it might resist. "The outbuildings have not been formally assessed since the tenancy of the previous mill operator. Your task is to produce a complete provenance record, current market valuation, and condition report on all contents and structure. 4 weeks." Eleanor opened the folder. She scanned the first page in the silence that followed, and what she found there was what she expected to find: a list of contents described in the vaguest possible terms, items grouped under headings such as miscellaneous ironwork and various domestic articles, values assigned in round numbers that had the softness of invention rather than the firmness of research, dates of assessment that did not correspond to any verifiable visit. The inventory had the signature quality of work done not to discover but to obscure. She closed the folder. 4 weeks is sufficient, she said. Crane's cuffs received another adjustment. Holt smiled as though she had said something endearing. Ashvale did not move, but something in the quality of his stillness changed, the way a room changes when someone opens a window in it without changing the temperature. He had expected acquiescence. What he had received was a flat statement of fact from a person who had assessed his paperwork and already found it wanting, and who had chosen, for reasons he could not yet determine, to say nothing about it. Eleanor Voss took the folder, tucked it under her arm, and waited. The meeting, to all appearances, was concluded. She was being sent to an estate of some historical significance to perform an unglamorous task for a fee already agreed, by a man who had looked at her and seen meekness. He would spend the next month revising that estimation, one small increment at a time. I will confess, I find this kind of story worth telling, and I am glad you have found your way to it. If you can settle in for a while, what follows is about a woman who was given a falsehood to investigate and found, at its center, something true. It is about documents and patience, and the particular form of courage that looks, to people who are not paying attention, exactly like obedience. I would love to know what draws you to these stories. Leave a word in the comments. The road to Harwick Mill was not, strictly speaking, a road any longer. It had been a road in the time of the mill's operation, some 9 years prior, and the intervening years had returned it to something closer to intention than actuality, a suggestion of passage through a corridor of hawthorn and elder that had grown inward from both sides, until the cart ruts beneath Eleanor's feet were the primary evidence that wheels had once come this way with purpose. She had hired a trap from the village of Casterby, 2 miles south, and the driver had left her at the gate with the manner of a man doing her a service he considered slightly beyond his obligations. She stood at the head of what had been the mill lane in the thin November light. She had allowed herself a full day after the meeting at Ashvale House before beginning, a day spent in the Casterby Records office, which had given her more than she had anticipated, and she held her appraisal case in one hand and her field notebook in the other, and looked at the property with the same unencumbered attention she gave to everything. Harwick Mill sat at a bend in the River Castor where the flow slowed and widened over a shallow shelf of limestone, and it had the particular quality of a substantial thing that has been let alone for too long, not collapsed, not ruined in any dramatic sense, but diminished, as though it had been slowly deciding to return to the ground from which its materials had come. The wheel housing was intact. The wheel itself had detached on one side and rested against the stone at an angle that would have been picturesque if it had been arranged, and the mill house, a 2-story structure of good local stone, retained both its roof and most of its window glass, which was more than Eleanor had expected from the condition report she had been given, which had described the structure as extensively damaged. Extensively. A provenance appraiser learns quickly that words like extensively and various and miscellaneous are the vocabulary of evasion. The real condition of a thing is measured, not described. Eleanor walked the perimeter first. She was methodical in a way that was not learnt from a textbook. It had been learnt in the field, in the particular school of other people's errors, and the first thing she had been taught was that the outside of a building tells you where to look inside. The north wall showed water ingress along the mortar course at the 3rd course below the eave. The south wall was sound. The east wall, which faced the river, had a section of repointing that was clearly recent, within 5 years, she estimated, examining the lime mix, which did not match the original and had been applied with speed rather than care. Someone had been inside this building, or had needed the outside of it to appear maintained, within the past 5 years. The official record said the mill had been entirely closed and unvisited since the departure of the previous tenant in 1889. She wrote, "East wall, repointing, approximate date 1893 to 95, inconsistent with vacancy records." She did not underline it. She did not need to. Inside, she began with the ground floor, working from the door toward the far wall in a systematic traverse, cataloging as she moved. The ironwork of the milling machinery, the pit wheel, the wallower, the great spur wheel with its wooden cogs partially intact, was recorded not as miscellaneous ironwork, but by component, by estimated age, by condition on a 5-point scale, by the type of iron and the evidence of its manufacture. This was not decoration. The difference between a pit wheel cast at Colebrookdale in 1840 and a replacement casting done locally in 1875 was the difference between a fixture of considerable interest to an industrial museum and a piece of useful scrap, and the folder Holt had given her had made no such distinction. It had assigned the entirety of the mill machinery a combined value of 40 pounds. Eleanor set down her appraisal case, opened it, and began. The afternoon came in through the west window and lay across the stone floor in a long rectangle of pale gold, and no one was present to watch Eleanor Voss do in 2 hours what had been done badly, or done with deliberate intent to misdirect, in all the years before her. She worked in the silence that she preferred to silence, the particular quiet of a mind fully occupied, accompanied by the sound of the river passing the wheel housing and the occasional drip of water from the repointed east wall, which she had already noted and would note again. To understand what Eleanor found in Harwick Mill, and why it mattered as much as it did, it is necessary to understand where Eleanor came from. The narrator must go back. There is no sufficient account of what follows without it. Eleanor Voss had been born the youngest daughter of a man named Charles Voss, who had spent 30 years as a senior cataloger for a firm of estate appraisers in Bristol, not the most glamorous of professions, and he had been the first to say so, and he had said it with the particular satisfaction of a person who loves what he does, precisely because no one is competing with him for the pleasure of it. Charles Voss had a gift for the language of objects. He could handle a piece of turned walnut and read in the wear of its surface a history more complete than the one in the catalog entry, could distinguish a documented piece from a well-made reproduction by the quality of the dovetail joints and the patina of the secondary wood on the back and sides, which is the part of a piece that no forger bothers to falsify with sufficient care. He had taught Eleanor to do the same before she was 12. By the time she was 16, she could conduct a full condition assessment of a room of furniture without instruction, write the cabinetwork descriptions in the correct nomenclature, cross-banding, stringing, ormolu mounts, quarter-cut veneer, and produce a valuation that her father would check and, with increasing frequency as she grew older, simply accept. She had attended the Grayfield School of Applied Arts and Conservation for 3 years, studying furniture and metalwork appraisal, and had graduated with the highest marks recorded in practical assessment in the school's history, which the school had noted in a letter, and Charles Voss had folded into his breast pocket and carried until the paper wore through at the creases. Then her father had died. This was the loss, and the narrator does not intend to make it smaller by dwelling on it, or to make it larger by the same means. Charles Voss had died in the winter of 1891, in the middle of a commission for the Grayfield firm, and Eleanor had finished the commission because there was no one else, and because finishing what was begun was among the first things her father had taught her. The commission had been for a modest manor in Wiltshire. The commission after that had been larger. The Grayfield firm had taken her on as a junior associate with some internal discomfort. They had no category for her, being female in a trade whose practitioners were entirely male, and she had worked within that discomfort without complaint, and with results that created a different kind of discomfort, the kind produced by excellence in a person one had expected to fail. She kept her father's cataloging notation system. She carried his field notebook, not the current one, which was her own and clearly labeled, but his last, which she kept in the outer pocket of her appraisal case, and which she had never shown anyone. She did not permit herself to think of him during working hours. The thinking was reserved for the evenings, brief and private, a form of accounting she kept current. The discipline of the work, the technical vocabulary of it, the particular authority of knowing what a thing is, and what it is worth, and who made it, and when, and under what circumstances, knowing it precisely, and being able to prove it from the evidence in hand. This was not simply her profession. It was the shape her grief had taken. the use to which she had put the love she would have given her father for many more years if years had been available. And it made her, at 29, the finest estate appraiser working for the Grayfield firm, which was a fact known to everyone at that firm, and acknowledged by no one at that level of directness. She did not need it acknowledged. The work itself was the record. The village of Casterby had one public house, one general goods shop, one church in regular use and one in intermittent use, and a small community of residents who had formed their opinions of Harwick Mill and the circumstances of its closure at some point in the recent past, and had not found occasion to revise them. Eleanor took rooms at the public house, the Millstone, which was a name whose reference was presumably geographic, and whose appropriateness was, under the circumstances, considerable. The landlady was a woman named Mrs. Purvis, who assessed Eleanor on arrival with the rapid and unsentimental precision of a person accustomed to forming correct judgments about strangers quickly, and said only that the water for washing was hot in the mornings and cold by noon, and that meals were at 7 and not after. This was the entirety of the instruction, and Eleanor found it sufficient. The other lodger at the Millstone was a man named Hargreave who sold agricultural machinery and was seldom present, which suited both of them. The resistance from the village was not hostile so much as it was encompassing. The blacksmith, from whom Eleanor had hoped to obtain some information about the ironwork at the mill, was unavailable whenever she visited. The parish clerk, whom she had approached at the records office in the hope of accessing the rate books for the mill's tenancy years, had discovered an unexpected problem with access to those particular volumes. A woman named Perch, who ran the general goods shop and who Eleanor had identified through 3 separate chance references as someone with a long memory for local affairs, was polite and efficient, and entirely without the specific recollections Eleanor required. On any of the 3 occasions Eleanor found reason to visit, the doors of Casterby were not locked. They were simply closed, in the manner of doors that have been closed before on the same subject and intend to remain closed. Eleanor worked regardless. What she could not obtain from people she obtained from objects, which were in many respects more forthcoming. On the 5th day she found the first ally. He was sitting on the low wall of the churchyard on a Tuesday morning in the first cold of what would become a severe November, watching her walk past with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a person who has reached an age at which the customs governing observation no longer apply. His name, she learnt within 3 minutes, was Arthur Haddon. He was 74, had been born in Casterby, had worked the millwright's trade for 41 years, and had retired at 67, and had since, as he put it in the 3-word sentence that served him, in place of an explanation of his days, watched the weather. He had known the mill in its working years. He had, in fact, done some of the maintenance on the milling gear in the years of the tenancy under a man named Sefton, who had operated the mill from 1883 to 1889. Sefton, Eleanor said. Yes. Haddon looked at her with the attention of someone performing a kind of appraisal of his own. You've seen the east wall. It was not a question. I have, Eleanor said. He nodded once, with the slow precision of someone confirming a long-held calculation. Then you know someone has. He said nothing more on that subject, and Eleanor did not press it. She sat on the wall beside him for a moment, looking at the church tower, and thought that this was the kind of plainness she trusted. He had told her what he knew she knew, which is a form of honesty available only to people who do not need to manage impressions. The weeks passed in the way that working weeks pass, with the texture of task rather than of event, one morning beginning where the previous evening had ended, the accumulation of records gaining weight and clarity as Eleanor moved through the mill's contents with the patience that the work required, and that the initial inventory had conspicuously failed to apply. By the end of the 2nd week, she had catalogued 347 individual items in the mill and its outbuildings, where the Holt folder had listed 49. Some of the discrepancy was accounted for by genuinely poor practice. The previous appraiser, Mr. Denny, had clearly grouped items that should have been separated, and had omitted to enter the contents of the lower storage room entirely, which might have been carelessness. It was not, but it might have been. The valuation figures told a cleaner story. The mill machinery alone, the pit wheel of good Colebrookdale casting, the well-preserved wooden machinery of the flour dressing mechanisms, the set of French burr millstones that were the finest Eleanor had seen outside a museum, represented a figure that bore no relationship to the 40 pounds assigned to all the ironwork combined. She had placed the millstones alone at 65 pounds, which was conservative. She had placed the complete milling installation at 190 pounds. She had placed the surveying instruments found in the upper room, a theodolite of a quality inconsistent with a mill operation, a set of ordnance drawing tools still in their fitted case, a collection of boundary maps rolled and tied and stored in the wooden chest that the Holt inventory had described as miscellaneous domestic furniture. She had placed these at a figure that troubled her, because they had no obvious reason to be in a mill house in rural Somerset, and because the boundary maps were not of the local farmland. They were of the Ashvale Estate's western quarter, and they covered the years 1887 to 1893, and some of them had been annotated in a hand she did not yet recognize. Haddon, when she described the maps without showing them, looked at the middle distance for a moment and then said, "The estate had a boundary dispute in '88. "What kind?" "The kind where the boundary moves after the argument." He turned up the collar of his coat against the wind. "Moved in Ashvale's favor." Eleanor wrote, "Boundary Survey Instruments, Anomalous Provenance, C. 1887 to 1893. Cross-reference to estate dispute records." She did not write what she was thinking, which was that someone had known these instruments were here and had not thought it necessary to mention them to the Grayfield firm. She noted also that the chest in which they had been stored bore no marks of recent opening on its hinges, which had been undisturbed under 6 years of accumulated dust, but that the floorboard beneath the chest, she had lifted it by habit, in the systematic traverse that was simply how she worked, had been disturbed within the last 3 months. Someone had come for something and had not found it, and the instruments were still in the chest because they were not what had been sought. In the evenings she reviewed the records she had obtained from the Casterby Records Office on the first day, the tenancy agreements for the mill from 1883 to 1889, showing Sefton as lessee and Crane, the land steward with his careful cuffs, as signatory for the estate. The rent was noted. The payments against rent were noted. There were 14 months across the 6-year tenancy in which no payment had been recorded, but in which no notice of arrear had been issued. She transferred these dates to a separate page at the back of her field notebook, in the compact notation she had taken from her father's system, and she found, as she added the months, that the pattern of the missing payments described a shape. The shape was not accidental. It was too consistent to be accidental. It was not yet evidence in the formal sense. It was the negative space that evidence leaves behind when it has been removed. She noted the shape and moved on. Marcus Ashvale arrived at Harwick Mill on a Thursday in the 3rd week of November without advance notice, which was his right as the property's owner, and which he exercised with the manner of a man who has not recently considered that his presence might be inconvenient to someone else's work. He came alone, on horseback, and arrived at the mill yard in the early afternoon, to find Eleanor in the upper room, with the boundary maps unrolled across the work table, her field notebook open beside them, and a magnifying glass in her left hand. The room was cold. A lamp burned on the corner of the table because the northern light through the single window was insufficient for the detail she was examining. She heard the horse, and she heard the step on the stair, and she continued reading the annotation in the corner of the 1889 boundary map, because the annotation was important, and because she had 3 words left of it, and then she looked up. He stood in the doorway in the manner of a man who has never had occasion to feel uncertain in a room. He looked at the maps on the table, and then at Eleanor, and then, briefly, and without intending to show it, at the maps again. "The reports," he said, "suggest the work is proceeding well." "The reports are accurate," Eleanor said. He moved further into the room in a way that was not quite natural, the movement of someone recalibrating a trajectory that was originally intended to be a simple inspection and has become something else. He stood at the far edge of the table and looked at the boundary maps with an expression that Eleanor catalogued as recognition. He had seen these maps before, or maps like them. He had perhaps not known they were still here. "These were in the chest," Eleanor said. It was not an accusation. It was the flat statement of a fact. Ashvale looked at her. "Denny did not inventory them," he said. "Denny's inventory was not complete." There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from ordinary silence, and Ashvale let it run for longer than was comfortable, and Eleanor did not fill it. She had, in the assessment of silences, considerable experience. "What is your current valuation of the property contents?" he asked at last. "I will have a written report in 7 days, she said. "I am asking now." Eleanor set down the magnifying glass and named the figure she had to date, not the final figure, but the working figure, which was already 4 times the original inventory's total. Marcus Ashvale stood with his hands in the manner of a man who has not quite found a satisfactory arrangement for them, and the particular quality of his stillness was different from Eleanor's. Hers was rooted, his was controlled, which is not the same thing, and Eleanor noted the difference. He looked at the maps once more and then at the annotation she had been reading, and she watched him decide not to ask about it, and she watched him reconsider, and she watched him decide again. He left without asking. She heard the horse on the lane and looked at the annotation and finished reading it. And the 3 words she had left were a surveyor's initials and a date, and the initials were W.C., and the date was 1891, and Mr. Crane's full name was William Crane. It was Haddon who told her the rest of it, on a Thursday evening at the millstone, sitting in the corner near the fire with his hands around a glass he barely touched. He had a way of arriving at his destination in speech by apparently traveling in another direction entirely, and Eleanor had learnt to follow the route rather than propose shortcuts. The mill, Haddon said, had been more profitable under Sefton than the estate record suggested. The grain trade through Casterby in the mid-1880s had been substantial. Eleanor had the trade figures from the records office, and she knew this was accurate. The rent agreed in the tenancy was set low, lower than the trade warranted, and the reason, Haddon said, looking at the fire rather than at Eleanor, in the manner of a man recounting something he had held too long. The reason was that Sefton paid additionally, in cash, to someone who was not the Duke of Ashvale and who was not the estate, and who arranged that the boundary dispute of 1888 would be resolved in a particular way, and that the resolution would benefit the estate's western farmland. And also, this was the part Haddon took longer to arrive at, also a series of private field purchases made by a person whose name was not on the estate rolls but whose decisions about which land to acquire in 1888 and 1889, immediately before the boundary resolution, had resulted in a significant private gain. Haddon had never spoken of this before. Eleanor asked him why he spoke of it now. He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "Because," he said, "somebody is telling the story with the wrong end forward, and it has gone on long enough." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. She thought about the 14 months of missing rent payments, which were not missing but redirected. She thought about the surveying instruments in the chest, placed there by someone who had understood their evidentiary value and had intended to return for them. She thought about the repointed east wall and the disturbed floorboard and Mr. Denny, who had taken ill so conveniently. She thought about Crane adjusting his cuffs and Holt sliding the folder across the table as though it were a courtesy. The injury done to the estate of Ashvale, to its legitimate accounts, its boundary records, its rental income correctly owed, had been ongoing for more than a decade, conducted with patience and access, and the mechanism that had sustained it was precisely the inventory process that was supposed to detect it. She opened her field notebook and began to write not notes but a summary, the first draft of what would become a formal submission, and she wrote it in the tight, clear hand her father had taught her, with the technical vocabulary that left no room for ambiguity and the citation method that Grayfield required, and that any court of law would find sufficient. And she wrote for 2 hours while Haddon sat beside her, in the comfortable silence of someone who has discharged a long-held obligation and found the weight, now that it is lifted, to have been precisely what he always knew it to be. The catastrophe arrived in the form of a locked door. On the Monday of the final week, Eleanor arrived at Harwick Mill to find that the upper room, in which the boundary maps and surveying instruments remained on the work table under her careful arrangement, was locked with a padlock that had not been there on Friday. The padlock was new. The hasp into which it was fitted was new. Someone had attended to this over the weekend with sufficient organization to obtain both items and affix them to a door that had stood unlocked for 6 years. Eleanor stood in front of it and assessed the situation with the attention she gave to all situations that announced themselves as obstacles, which was to say, she stood quietly and considered what the obstacle told her about the person who had placed it. A new lock on a door previously open tells you that someone has recently understood what is behind it. It tells you the understanding was urgent, and the urgency was unplanned, because a planned response would not have used a new padlock on an old door, which announces itself. It tells you that the person responsible has access to the property, and believes the lock will be sufficient to conclude the matter. Eleanor went to find Mrs. Purvis, because there are kinds of information that are held by landladies the way mills hold grain, without announcement, without ceremony, simply because it is what they do. Mrs. Purvis had seen, on Sunday morning, a carriage on the Harwick Lane. A good carriage. She had seen it from the upper window while she aired the rooms. She had noted it because carriages did not come down that lane without reason. She described the color, dark green with a black roof. Eleanor thanked her and returned to the mill and stood before the locked door and considered the figure of Crane, with his self-adjusting cuffs, arriving in a dark green carriage on a Sunday morning in November to address a problem he had not anticipated, which was Eleanor Voss. She could, at this point, have gone to Asheville directly. She had sufficient material to justify it. The valuation discrepancy, the missing rent records, the boundary maps and their annotations, Haddon's account. She had sufficient material, and she did not go, not yet. She went instead to the records office in Casterby and spent the afternoon with the rate books she had not been permitted to access on her first attempt, because the clerk who had obstructed her access on the first attempt was absent on Mondays, and the second clerk was simply a second clerk and knew no particular reason to refuse. She spent 3 hours with the rate books and the original tenancy agreements and a letter she had found folded into the surveying case on the day she first opened it. A letter she had not shown anyone and had not referenced in her working notes. A letter written in the same hand as the boundary map annotations, and which was addressed to a name that was not Crane and not Holt but a third name, a name she had needed the rate books to confirm, and which the rate books now confirmed with the clean finality of a closed door. She left the records office in the early dark, the chill of the street sharp against her face, carrying the weight of what she now held in her notebook and in the surveying case. She had what was needed. She walked back to the millstone through the cold and thought about her father's aphorism, which he had offered not once but consistently, across the years of her training, in the plain voice of someone repeating a true thing that does not require elevation. The value of a thing is what remains when everything false has been accounted for. She had been accounting for a long time. The accounting was complete. The reckoning was conducted over 2 days in the second week of December, in a room at the Greyfield offices in Bristol, and it was administrative in the precise sense that the word deserves, a proceeding conducted through documents, not through declarations, in which the documents spoke more clearly than any of the people present could have managed or desired. Eleanor had submitted her formal report 5 days prior, a document of 37 pages, comprising the complete inventory with provenance notes and valuations, the condition assessment of structure and contents, the annotated summary of the rental records against the estate accounts, and a concluding section titled simply, "Discrepancies Noted," which occupied 11 pages and was written in language so precise and so thoroughly supported by the appended primary documents that the solicitor from the third firm, the one not Holt and Bray, who had been engaged by Ashvale to review Eleanor's findings, had read it twice and told his client that he could find no error and suggested that the relevant parties be invited to respond to it. Crane responded to it by resigning his position as land steward the day before the meeting, which is a form of response that tells its own story. Holt responded to it by arriving with a solicitor of his own and a demeanor that had shed its smile, and replaced it with something more careful, more studied. The third name, the name from the rate books and the letter, did not attend, and his absence was recorded as part of the proceedings, which meant it would appear in the court record that the Greyfield firm subsequently submitted to the relevant county authority, and which is of no further concern to this account, except to note that matters of financial malpractice, like water through a repointed wall, eventually find their level. Ashvale was present throughout both days, seated at the end of the room opposite Eleanor, in the same arrangement, though the room was warmer, as the first meeting at Ashvale House. He did not speak often. When he did, he asked questions that were precise, and that Eleanor answered with the same precision, in the manner of two instruments that have been calibrated against the same standard. At the close of the second day, when the other parties had been addressed and the documents had been submitted and the administrative business had reached its formal conclusion, Ashvale crossed the room to where Eleanor was returning her working papers to the appraisal case in the careful order she always used. He stood at what was neither a social distance nor an intimate one and said, "The millstones." Eleanor looked up. "Yes. You valued them at £65. Conservatively, I should like to understand the basis for the valuation." Eleanor regarded him for a moment with the level attention she had applied to most of the furniture she had catalogued, not with any intent to compare him to furniture, but because the habit of attention was consistent, and because she was deciding something. "They are French burr millstones," she said, "quarried in the Forêt de la Ferté, almost certainly in the 1860s. That provenance is established by the quarry mark on the lower stone and the character of the freshwater quartz. A set in that condition and with that provenance is not common." A pause. "I place them conservatively because the market is narrow." Ashvale looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who is being shown something and has the intelligence and the honesty to see it. "Miss Voss," he said. He did not immediately continue. "Your Grace." "I had assumed," he said, choosing his words with the care of someone handling something fragile for the first time and being aware of it, "that Denny's inventory was the product of poor workmanship." She did not let him finish without a word. "It was not," she said, "the quietest possible statement, the most sufficient. Time moves differently once the accounting is complete." The winter that followed the proceedings at Greyfield was ordinary in its weather and remarkable in its increments. The boundary records were corrected, the estate accounts were adjusted, the mill was withdrawn from sale. Harwick Mill was not withdrawn because the accounts required it, or because the proceeding had produced that result. It was withdrawn because Ashvale withdrew it, and the reason he gave in the formal communication to Holt and Bray's successor firm, a brief, unadorned letter Eleanor did not see until much later, was that the property contained assets of sufficient significance to warrant a proper restoration study before any disposition was considered. Arthur Haddon, who had not been asked to provide formal testimony but who had given Eleanor a signed written account of his knowledge that she had included as an appendix to the discrepancies section, received a letter from the estate in January expressing thanks for his service. He told Eleanor about it on a Tuesday morning from the wall of the churchyard. He said the letter was the first communication he had received from the estate in 11 years. He said this without bitterness, in the manner of a man noting a correction in a long-standing record. Things settle, he said, which was both observation and aphorism, and which Eleanor would carry for a long time in the same part of her mind where she kept her father's words. Eleanor returned to Harwick Mill in the early spring at the request of the estate, which was to say at the request of Marcus Ashvale, for the purpose of completing the restoration assessment she had been asked to prepare. A different commission, longer, more detailed, the kind of work she had wanted to do on the property from the first afternoon. She found the east wall freshly and correctly repointed, the work done with care and matched lime, the kind of work that holds. She found the upper room unlocked. The boundary maps and surveying instruments had been removed during the proceedings and were being held as evidence, but the work table was there, and the northern light through the window was the same pale, clear light of February, and the river below moved steadily over the limestone shelf with the particular sound of water that knows its course. She was standing at the table reviewing her initial field notes when she heard the step on the stair. Ashvale stood in the doorway in a manner that was different from November, more uncertain and more honest for the uncertainty. He carried in his right hand a rolled document that he held slightly away from his body in the manner of a person presenting something rather than carrying it. The original mill lease, he said, from 1878, before Sefton. He unrolled it on the table beside her notes. It was the lease under which the mill had originally been granted, and in the schedule of contents attached to it was a description of the millstones, the French burr millstones, correctly identified, correctly provenanced, valued at the time of the original lease at £70. My grandfather knew what they were, Ashvale said. Yes, Eleanor said. They stood beside the table in the winter light from the northern window, two people looking at a document that told the truth about something that had been misrepresented for a long time, and the river went on below them, and the wheel that had rested at its angle for 6 years had been righted in January, she noticed now through the glass, and stood again in the water. It was not turning. Not yet. The value of a thing, Eleanor thought, is what remains when everything false has been accounted for. She had not said this aloud. She did not need to. Ashvale looked at the lease, and then at her, and did not look away, and she met his eyes with the same undefended stillness she had turned toward him in that cold room in October, and this time he named it correctly. He said nothing. He placed his hand on the table beside hers, not touching, an inch away, the distance of a question rather than a declaration, and Eleanor Voss did not step back. She was not the kind of person who steps back from things she has already assessed and found to be sound. Thank you for staying with this story to its last word. That is not a small thing. This kind of telling takes time, and you gave it time, and I am grateful for that. If it moved you or made you think of something in your own life, I would very much like to know. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what this story brought to mind. Those comments are read, every one. If you would like to be here when the next story is told, a subscription ensures you will be. And the question I want to leave with you is this: have you ever found that the truest account of something, a place, a person, a situation you misunderstood, only became available to you after you were willing to sit still long enough to let the false readings fall away? The spring commission unfolded across 6 weeks, and in that time the mill came to know Eleanor in the way that buildings know the people who attend to them with genuine interest, which is to say, It yielded its information gradually, and at the pace it chose, and she received each disclosure with the patience that had by now become not merely a professional habit, but the governing weather of her interior life. She worked through the ground floor first, as she had in the autumn, but with a different purpose. Not inventory, now, but assessment of what could be preserved, and what could be restored, and what had been lost beyond the reach of restoration. The pit wheel could be remounted. The great spur wheel required new cogs in the upper quarter, and the wood for those cogs, she specified it in the assessment as compass timber. The curved grain oak that resists splitting under load would need to be sourced carefully, and she wrote down the name of a timber merchant in Bath whom her father had trusted, because trust in trades of this kind passes by recommendation and not by advertisement. The millstones she had left to last, because the millstones required her full attention, and she had learnt, in the years of her practice, that the things most worth looking at closely deserve the portion of the day when the eye is freshest. She examined the lower stone on a bright Tuesday morning in early March, kneeling on the stone floor of the ground room with the lamp angled to throw the surface of the dressing into relief, the pattern of furrows and lands that directed the grain outward from the eye, the central hole, the precisely maintained balance of the cutting surface that a skilled millstone dresser would have read like a text in a familiar language. The dressing was original. It had not been touched since the mill's last working day, and the fact of this, of a craftsman's work preserved in its original state for nearly a decade simply by the accident of neglect and a locked door, gave Eleanor a feeling she did not permit herself to describe as pleasure while she was working, though it was that, and something in addition to that, a sense of having recovered something that had been given up for lost, which is the particular satisfaction of her trade, and which cannot be produced by any other means. Ashvale came to the mill on 3 separate occasions during the spring commission, and each time the quality of his arrival was different from the last. The first time he brought the estate's historical accounts, bound volumes of the annual summaries going back to 1851, which he set on the work table without explanation, and which Eleanor opened and began to read while he stood near the window in the manner of a man who has brought a gift and is uncertain whether it was the right one. She told him it was the right one, not in those words, but by reading for 20 minutes without looking up, which he understood. The second visit he brought no documents and offered no pretext, and stood in the doorway for a moment in the particular way of a person who has arrived without a reason prepared, and has decided to stand by that fact, and Eleanor said, without looking up from the millstone dressing she was recording, that there was a second chair in the upper room. He brought it down. He sat for an hour while she worked, not speaking, not requiring speech, and Eleanor was aware of his presence in the room with the same clear peripheral attention she applied to the river below the window and the wind in the hawthorn on the lane, which is to say she was aware of it, and found it untroubling, and in some way part of the room's character, part of the particular quality of the place, and she did not examine this awareness closely, because it was not yet the kind of thing that required examination. The third visit was different. He arrived in the late afternoon on a Friday, near the end of the commission, and Eleanor was upstairs with the boundary maps, which had been returned from the evidence process with a court seal on the case, and a letter confirming their status as property of the estate. She was completing the final section of the restoration assessment, which concerned the upper room itself and its contents, and she was writing the provenance entry for the theodolite, a Ramsden pattern instrument, she had concluded, English-made, consistent with the 1860s, the kind of instrument used in professional surveying work, when Ashvale came to the top of the stair. He did not stop at the doorway this time. He came to the table and stood beside her and looked at what she was writing, and she let him read it, because it contained nothing he did not know, and the question of what Crane had done with the instruments, and for whose benefit, and for how long, had been settled in the Bristol proceedings, and did not require further treatment here. What Ashvale said was, "My father trusted him." Eleanor set down her pen. She allowed the statement to occupy the room for the time it required. "Your father trusted him," she said, confirming it as fact rather than as complaint. "He worked for the estate for 22 years. Yes." She did not say what she thought about this, which was that 22 years is long enough for a deception to acquire the texture of truth, to settle into the structure of an institution like water into stone, invisibly, until the damage is structural. She did not say it because Ashvale knew it, and saying it would have been a form of instructing him in something he had already learnt at a cost she had no wish to increase. What she said was, "The instruments are properly accounted for now. The record is correct." This was the thing she could offer that was actually available to offer, and she offered it plainly, without reduction. He looked at her. The light in the upper room in the late afternoon was different from the morning light, warmer, more amber, coming now from the west through the window, at an angle that touched the work table, and the rolled maps, and the open pages of Eleanor's field notebook, the one that was her own, with her own hand on every page. He said, "I owe you a more direct acknowledgement than I have given." Eleanor considered this offer and found it honest, which was more than she had expected from him in the autumn, and somewhat less than she could see him capable of now. And she said only, "The report will speak clearly enough." He shook his head. Not in disagreement precisely, but in the manner of a man setting aside the convenient alternative and choosing the one that costs something. "I assumed," he said, "when Holt brought you the commission, that you would confirm what was there and report what you were directed to report." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I know." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the Bristol room and had seen twice since, the expression of a man who has been shown something true and is in the process of adjusting the whole of his previous understanding to accommodate it. "I was wrong," he said. The sentence was short. It was not dressed up or extended, and he did not follow it with explanation, and Eleanor found the brevity of it more creditable than any elaboration could have been. She said, "You were not the only person in that October meeting who made assumptions." She allowed a brief pause, the kind that functions as a door opening rather than closing. "I assumed the mill's contents would be straightforwardly mishandled. What I found was a good deal more deliberate, and you said nothing until you had the full account." "That is how it is done," Eleanor said. It was her father's method, stated plainly, the principle on which every assessment he had ever taught her had been built. You do not report a partial account as though it were a complete one, because the damage done by premature conclusions is the same whether the conclusion is wrong or merely incomplete. She had held to this across the whole of the commission, through the locked door and the missing rent records and the 3 months of closed-door resistance from Casterby, and she held to it now in the different, quieter pressure of this conversation, which was requiring a similar discipline. Ashvale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The millstones, you said £65 was conservative." "It was. What would you say now, with the provenance complete?" Eleanor considered the question as she would have considered any question of valuation, seriously, precisely, with the full weight of what she knew brought to bear on it. £80, she said. "Perhaps more, to the right buyer." "There is a mill in Oxfordshire," Ashvale said, "whose owner has been looking for a matched pair of this age and quality for 3 years. I had a letter from his agent in February." Eleanor looked at him. "You have not replied to it." "I was waiting for the restoration assessment." She held his gaze with the undefended steadiness that had troubled him in October, and that he had, she understood now, spent the intervening months learning to meet rather than to name. Outside, the river moved over the limestone shelf with the constancy of a thing that has been doing this for a long time and intends to continue. The wheels stood in the water. The evening was coming in cold and clear from the east, the kind of evening that promises a hard frost but holds the last of the light late and long. and the upper room of Harwick Mill was warm with the lamp and the amber of the declining sun through the western glass, and Eleanor Voss was aware of all of this at the outer edge of her attention, while the center of it held steadily on the man standing beside the table and the 3 inches of air between his hand and hers. He moved his hand those 3 inches. His fingers covered hers on the open page of her field notebook, the page on which she had been writing the provenance entry for the theodolite, among the words quarried and documented and recovered, and Eleanor turned her hand over and held his, and the gesture was as exact and as deliberate and as fully assessed as everything she had ever done, and it was warm. The value of a thing, as her father had said, and as Haddon had repeated in his plain way by the churchyard wall, and as Eleanor had known in her bones since the first afternoon she had knelt on the stone floor of this mill and set her lamp to the dressing of the millstones, is what remains when everything false has been accounted for. What remained here was sufficient. It was, in fact, more than sufficient. It was the kind of thing that, once correctly identified and properly recorded, a competent person does not walk away from.